we are looking at Jamaica's political landscape. It's basically the JLP versus the PNP, because those are the two major political parties that we have in Jamaica right now. Because as much as third parties try to get a foothold in the leadership, for some reason or others, Jamaicans are not willing to engage any other party but these two parties. All right. So the JLP, right, started in 1943, and they advocate for free market policies and lower taxes, and they are associated with a higher GDP growth and lower unemployment, but also higher crime and corruption. And this is quite evident because, you know, the JLP was the one who kept increasing the minimum wage threshold and so on and so forth. Whereas I don't think the PNP has ever increased the minimum wage. I'm not saying that they haven't, but I can't recall a time when they did. The times when we had the increases were under the JLP's leadership. So we can see that this is, this is basically their policy. Now, the PNP started in 1938, and they support social democratic policies like welfare programs. So we are talking about like the PATH program and job creation initiatives. Remember, Portia came up with the JEEP program as well. And they are linked to higher inflation and unemployment, as well as slower economic growth. So you can see right off the jump, like the stark contrast between the JLP and the PNP. Now, let us look at some of Jamaica's past prime minister. And the first one that we're going to look at is Edward Seaga, and he was the leader of the JLP from 1980 until 1989. And under his leadership, Jamaica had the highest inflation rate at 77.3% and an unemployment at 24.3% during his term. And we also recorded the lowest GDP under Edward Seaga's administration. The next prime minister that we had was Michael Manley, right? And he was the prime minister from 1989 until 1992. And during his time, inflation reached 41.7%. And that would have been, I think the highest that it was, was about 107% during Manley time. I think that the inflation reached as high as 107% during Manley's time. Then we get to Percival James Patterson, or PJ Patterson as everybody know him. And he was the prime minister from 1992, to 2006. And, you know, PJ is the longest serving prime minister of Jamaica. And he oversaw a decline in unemployment, inflation, and murders. The next prime minister was Bruce Golding, and he was the prime minister from 2007 until 2011. And under his leadership, Jamaica experienced the highest ranking on the Corruption Perception Index, and the highest murders were recorded during Bruce Golding's administration. And as you can see, we are looking at the past 40 years, right? So from 1984 until 2023, that is the period that we're looking at. Then we have Portia Simpson Miller, and she was the prime minister from 2012 until 2016, and we saw record unemployment rates, which averaged 8.98% during her government. The last and final one is Andrew Holness, and he's the leader of the JLP, and he took office in 2017 and has held office from 2017 up until this present moment as I'm speaking to you. And he has the highest GDP per capita, averaging 5,637 US dollars, and the lowest unemployment and inflation averages were experienced under the leadership of Andrew Holness. Okay, so let us look at the key economic and social indicators, right? And the first one that we're starting with is the corruption rank. Now, when it comes to corruption rank, the lower the number, the better it is, right? So if you are number one, it simply means that your country not corrupt at all. You are the least corrupt country in the world, right? And if you are number 80, you would have been the most corrupt. So the lower the number, the better it is where the corruption rank is concerned. Now, the JLP is associated with the higher corruption ranks. Jamaica's highest rank on the corruption perception index was in 2009 under the leadership of Bruce Golding with a rank of 99, and that's the highest rank that we have had since the corruption perception index started rankings in 1995. So they never start in 1984, even though I'm looking at a 40-year period. The corruption index started in 1995. And as you can see here, Bruce Golding led the most corrupt government from 2007 to 2011. Now, I should clarify this by saying that the ranking is not an indication as to whether or not the Prime Minister himself is corrupt. It's just where Jamaica ranked on the Corruption Perception Index under that particular Prime Minister's administration. So under the Bruce Golding led administration, Jamaica was the most corrupt in all of the history of Jamaica. The next indicator that we're going to look at is murders, right? And this is one of the most pressing issues that Jamaica has to contend with. So under the leadership of the JLP, Jamaica recorded the highest number of murders, 1,683 in 2009, and once again, this was under the Bruce Golding led administration. So if we go back to corruption, Bruce Golding government led the highest ranking of 99, and now we come a murder and Bruce Golding at the head again with the highest number of murders recorded in the history of Jamaica in 2009. Now, the highest average for murders was with the JLP again, with an average of 1,156 murders over the last 40 years. Now, of course, the average is not in terms of 40 years, because then there wouldn't be any way to compare it. What I looked at was the periods of time when the JLP was in power and the murders that were recorded in those years, and then I take an average of that. And then I looked at the period of time when the PNP was in power and the record number of murders during those years, and then I took an average of that. And it is interesting to note that the PNP over the last 40 years has been in power for 58% of the time. Yeah, 58% of the time, while I did a little thing here, right? So the PNP was in power over the last 40 years for 58% of the time, while the JLP was in power for 42% of the time. But if you look at the last 20 years, it's basically the reverse, where the JLP was in power for 60% and the PNP was in power for 40%. If you look at the last 20 years now, you see where the JLP hold the record for the highest average murders recorded with an average of 1,452, and Bruce Golding had the highest average as Prime Minister of 1,493. So when I looked at all the prime ministers that we have had so far, and then I would look at the number of years that they were in power and the murders that were recorded when they were in power, and I took an average, Bruce Golding come out on top with the highest average out of all of the prime minister them, and his average was 1,493. So we are seeing where murder and corruption flourished when Bruce Golding was in power. So let us go back to the next metric, right? And that is unemployment. Now this is an interesting one, right? So the script flips here, and we're seeing where the JLP is linked to lower rates of unemployment on average, and the highest unemployment rate was recorded under the leadership of Edward Seaga, when unemployment was at an all-time high of 25.6% back in 1984. That's before me and Uno went ban, or most people. that was before most of us were even on this planet. But you know, we're looking back to 40 years. So if you're not 40, obviously some of the information would be before your time. And then the highest average unemployment based on who was in power was under the JLP, with an average of 11.68% unemployment over their 17-year reign from the last 40 years. So obviously, when we're looking at the unemployment average, I'd have to look at all the years that the JLP has been in power and then average it out. And same for the JLP, for the PNP. And the JLP had the highest average unemployment, right? However, the highest unemployment rate recorded over the last 20 years. So if you look at a 40-year period, the JLP had the highest average. If we trim it down to the last 20 years, then the PNP had the highest average of 9.7% in 2013, and that was no. This is a single. So the highest unemployment rate that was recorded in the last 20 years. Wagwan Sheldon. The highest unemployment rate that was recorded over the last 20 years was 9.7% in 2013, when Portia Shimson Miller was the Prime Minister. And then the highest average unemployment rate in the past 20 years was 8.15% under the PNP. So it really depends on how you're looking at the metric. If it's 40 years, it's the JLP. If it's 20 years, it's the PNP. So let us look at the next metric. So the next metric is inflation, right? And inflation, the JLP government. So when you come on to the economy, the JLP has that luck. When you come on to the people of Jamaica, the PNP have that luck. So JLP government saw lower inflation. Typically, the economy did not do well under the PNP leadership. So the economy do well under JLP, the economy not do good under PNP. The highest recorded inflation in the last 40 years was 77.6% in 1992 under the leadership of Michael Manley. And I don't know how PNP as Michael Manley was the best leader, because the data does not show that. The highest average inflation rate over the past 40 years was 17.05%, and that was under the PNP. So in the last 20 years, the highest recorded inflation was 22.02% in 2008 under the leadership of Bruce Golding. Here, as you can see that so far Bruce Golding take the lead when it comes to the worst prime minister with Jamaica have. He should have turned over NDM. And then the final point on the inflation is that the highest average inflation in the past 20 years was 8.46% under the PNP, with the average for the JLP being 8.4%. So, I mean, when you look at the highest average inflation over the past 20 years, then basically are the same, because there's just a 0.6% difference between the average for the JLP and the average for the PNP. So when you come on to the average inflation, then there is no better than the TIDA. That is over the last 20 years anyway. But the worst one of the lot was Bruce Golding, where inflation was 22.2% in 2008. The next metric that we're going to look at is the GDP per capita. And here, GDP per capita, the higher the number is, the better. Under the leadership of the JLP, Jamaica recorded the highest GDP per capita of $6,838 US in 2023, with Andrew Holness as the helm. So under Andrew's government, Jamaica recorded the highest GDP per capita. Now we're going to move on to corruption and murder trends. That's the next metric that we're going to look at. And crime, violence, and corruption were the biggest issues that plagued the JLP. And I mean, we can see that right now. Murders are on the rise, and you know, they're doing all these states of emergencies and what have you, and they don't seem to be working. So the data doesn't lie. The data doesn't lie. So when it comes to murders, right, in the last 40 years, 42,115 Jamaicans were murdered. So in the last 40 years, 42,115 Jamaicans were murdered. Of that number, 47% or 19,952 Jamaicans were killed while the JLP was in power, while 53% or 22,453 Jamaicans were killed while the PNP was in power. But we have to keep in mind that the PNP was in power for a total of 5 years more than the JLP. So if we really are supposed to assess it properly, the JLP ain't supposed to be so close. You understand? There shouldn't just be a 3 percentage point difference from the PNP, because the PNP have 5 years span them. And even with that 5-year lead, the PNP, the JLP is still the neck and neck with the PNP. So this not really said the PNP had more murders, because they had a longer serving time. So clearly the number would be a little bit bigger, right? I don't know how I could have adjusted it for that 5-year gap. I don't know. I'm not really too good on statistics like that. So I don't know me could adjust for that, right? And I'm sure you would have seen like something a little bit more different. Now, when it comes to corruption, oh my God, corruption flourished under the leadership of Bruce Golding, but you know, it kind of trended downwards in the years following his resignation, with Jamaica moving from a rank of 99 in 2008 to a rank of 69, the lowest it has ever been since 2015. So, you know, we have been trending down on the corruption index in the years following Bruce Golding's resignation. The JLP arguably is the most corrupt government in the history of Jamaica, and crime and violence skyrocket under their leadership. This is what the data is showing, right? In terms of crime and violence and corruption, it's more pronounced when the JLP is in power. So we go look at unemployment and economic stability, right? So the economy seems to do a lot better under the JLP's leadership than under the PNP. So basically the JLP are better at managing the economy, right? The PNP don't know what they do. The lowest unemployment rate in the last 40 years occurred in 2023, reaching 4.2% under the leadership of Andrew Holness. In contrast, the highest unemployment rate was 25.6%, and that was in 1984 under the leadership of Edward Siaga. So unemployment generally decreased when PJ Patterson assumed leadership in 1992 and continued to decline until Bruce Golding took over in 2009. Typically, the PNP has struggled more in handling Jamaica's economy, experiencing the highest average inflation of 17.5% over their leadership in the last 40 years. This trend continues in the most recent 2 decades, that is, the last 20 years, where they also recorded the highest average inflation rate of 8.46%. So then we go and look now at economic prosperity. Now, under Andrew Holness's leadership in 2023, Jamaica achieved its highest ever GDP per capita, reflecting a prosperous economic period. In contrast, the lowest recorded GDP per capita occurred in 1985 under the leadership of Edward Siaga, highlighting economic challenges during that time. Over the past 40 years, the JLP has demonstrated high economic prosperity with an average GDP per capita of $4,177 during their periods in power. In comparison, the PNP's average GDP per capita was $3,445 during their governance. Analyzing the last 2 decades, the JLP continued to lead in economic performance with the highest average GDP per capita reaching $5,317. Andrew Holness, as Prime Minister, notably contributed to this economic success during his leadership. And so we're going to now look at, like a side-by-side comparison of the JLP based on these performance matrices and the PNP. So, let me see if we can big this up. I think that's a little bit too... Hold on. Alright, I think... Yeah. So, the JLP had both the best and the worst. JLP need to make up their mind what they want to do. The JLP had both the best and the worst prime ministers in the past 40 years. Over the last 40 years, the worst prime minister that Jamaica ever have was during the JLP time, and the best prime minister that Jamaica ever had, based on these performance indicators, was also when the JLP was in power. So PNP just PNP no serve no purpose right here now. Bruce Golding is the worst. Bruce Golding is the worst prime minister that Jamaica has had in the last 40 years. So now we know who the worst prime minister is. No need for a guess and spell and I say Andrew or Bruce Golding. Bruce Golding is the worst prime minister that Jamaica has had over the last 40 years, since crime, violence and corruption escalated significantly during his leadership with detrimental consequences. And everybody knew about the Tivoli Gardens incursion, right, and the whole Manat Phelps and Phillips inquiry that followed after. Now, the 5 years under Bruce Golding's leadership, so I think from 2007 to 2011, right, recorded the highest average corruption percentage. So the highest average corruption perception was during Bruce Golding's time, and similarly, the highest average number of murders was when Bruce Golding was in power. So not only was Jamaica perceived as the most corrupt country when Bruce Golding was in power, but Jamaica saw its bloodiest period when Bruce Golding was in power. In the last 20 years, Bruce Golding also oversaw the highest inflation average, reaching so him do bad everywhere. There was nothing good under Bruce. The worst corrupt, the Jamaica had the worst corruption perception, the most murders, the highest average inflation. Like, Bruce Golding mash up Jamaica. Bruce Golding mash up Jamaica. Bruce Golding oversaw the highest average inflation, reaching 12.2%, and this was the highest rate of inflation among all prime ministers during that time. So, and also, I guess this is one good thing now. Andrew Holness, while also showing a good record, had the lowest average corruption rank during his leadership. So when you look at the second lowest corruption rank, it was under Andrew. But we jump over PNP and you know what going on with PNP. So PJ Patterson, during his 18-year governance of Jamaica from 1992 to 2006, achieved the lowest corruption perception with an average corruption rank of 54. So basically, Jamaica was perceived as the least corrupt, or the lowest ranking where we ever have, on average, the corruption perception index was when PJ Patterson was in power. PJ Patterson's leadership in 2002 resulted in Jamaica's lowest corruption rank. So the lowest corruption rank that Jamaica has had since the ranking started in 1995 was 42, and that was under PJ Patterson's leadership. Portia Simpson Miller as the Prime Minister, achieved the lowest average murders among all Prime Ministers, with murders averaging 1,147 under her leadership. So the Prime Minister were at the lowest average in terms of recorded murders was Portia Simpson Miller. Right? So the PNP, I mean, when it comes to corruption and murder, they don't seem to do that badly. When we look at the analysis now of the political landscape, Andrew Holness achieved the lowest average unemployment rate in Jamaica's history. And in 2023, the country recorded its lowest unemployment rate under his leadership. Now, the lowest average inflation rate was observed during Andrew Holness's administration, with unemployment averaging 5.8% from 2017 to 2023. And under Andrew Holness's government again, Jamaica experienced the highest GDP per capita, averaging $5,637. And when we look at these matrices, Andrew Holness emerges as the best Prime Minister in Jamaica over the last 40 years. And this was surprising to me, because I believe that Andrew was the worst Prime Minister Jamaica has, but the data is saying otherwise. So when we look at the performance matrices, Andrew is the best Prime Minister Jamaica has had in the last 40 years, and this is marked by economic achievements, a gradual decline in corruption. Because if you look at the data, right, and you look at corruption under Andrew. So Andrew came into power in 2017 here, right? So here he was. And then when you look at Jamaica's ranking, so when Andrew took over from Portia, we were at 83. Right? So in 2016, when Portia was the Prime Minister, we were at 83 on the corruption index. Then in 2017, we moved up to 68. Remember, the lower the number, the better it is. And we can see where, he has been kind of struggling to kind of keep it, but it is still lower than what Portia had. Portia averaged 81, Andrew averaged 70. You understand? So I mean, it basically declined from Bruce Golding time, where Bruce Golding was averaging 90. It kind of went down under Portia a little bit, but Portia when I struggled to, but we went down under Andrew Holness's leadership. It's not, the data says what the data says, whether we believe it or not. That is what the data says. So Andrew is the best Prime Minister based on, when you look at, even if you look at, these are the unemployment rates, like single digits. Well, single digits. So his average unemployment rate is 5.8, and that's the lowest. So you're looking at corruption, him they'll do well. You look at unemployment, he's doing well. You look at inflation, 5.68, that's the average during his 7-year reign. Still the lowest, right? This is the exchange rate. I just couldn't figure out how to factor that in, something about that about it. And he had the highest GDP per capita ever. So, I mean, in all the matrices that I looked at, I mean, murder wasn't one of them. He didn't do so well with murder, right? Out of the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, he was the only one who scored high in 4, right? So he came out on top as the best prime minister that Jamaica has had in the last 40 years. However, when we are assessing the overall impact, there are no clear winners between the JLP and the PNP. So this are coming like the local government election. Nobody know who win because the two of them are do bad in a respective year. The JLP are do bad pan crime and corruption, and the PNP are do bad pan unemployment and the economy. So a 50-50 basically, right? So the JLP has seen both the best and the worst prime minister. So yes, although the best prime minister is a JLP, but the worst prime minister is also a JLP, and me just feel like he cancel each other out, right? So this is leading now to a mix of economic success and turbulent periods, and now we the little people them suffer. Right, the JLP has faced challenges with corruption perception and periods of significant crime and violence, especially during Bruce Golding's leadership. On the other hand, the PNP has had a relatively lackluster impact on the Jamaican economy, with the worst unemployment rates and higher inflation during their leadership negatively affecting the country's economic well-being. So it's like when you look on the two of them, no better hearing, me don't know what else to say, no better hearing, no better barrel. So in conclusion, both the JLP and the PNP show, distinct strengths and weaknesses. The JLP has proven effective in driving economic growth. That is not contestable. Whether we like them or we don't like them, we can't argue the data. So the JLP has proven to be effective in driving economic growth, but I guess we could say that these benefit primarily the corporate elites, right? And this lead to a lack of significant improvement for the average Jamaican. So even though because they keep saying, the economy is growing, and we saying the one that says, sir, where the economy they grow because me now feel it, the growth is not trickling down to me. And that is the problem that the JLP has. Yes, they're doing well where the economy is concerned, and they're providing employment. But the surge in the economic employment under the JLP has not translated into widespread prosperity for all Jamaicans, right? And we have issues of escalating crime rates and inadequate wages. So I wanted to talk about this point a little bit, because this is one of the selling points of the JLP, that, the economy is growing. And yes, the economy is growing, because when you look at the data, the Jamaican economy is growing, but the Jamaican people are not seeing the growth. And it is evidence throughout the whole data set that the JLP do not care about the Jamaican people. So the country is doing well, but Jamaicans are not doing well. So what does that tell you? So it's like, okay, the country have $1 billion and everybody hungry and broke. So where the money there? That is what is happening in Jamaica. Jamaica is doing well. Jamaica is growing. The da-da-da is happening. And it's like, where is the money? Because all the wealth concentrates at the top. And that is the modus operandi of the JLP. So yes, Jamaica is doing well, but it's the rich people that are benefiting. So they come and they give you the BPOs and they give you the call centers, and you have a job and you work like a bitch for lily and nothing. So they can say unemployment is down, but you're employed and can barely afford to live. You still need help from your friends and relatives to pay your bills. How does that make any sense? It is not gainful employment. So while you can say, unemployment has been the lowest in the history of Jamaica, and it has at 4.20% in 2023, but Jamaicans are worst off. So how is it that you have the highest employment rate in the history of Jamaica, and Jamaicans are doing the worst that they have ever done in the history of Jamaica. Make it make sense. It doesn't make any sense. You have the highest employment rate, and people are suffering worse than when the employment rate went high. Because if you go to Michael Manley time, unemployment reached inflation, inflation reached as high as 107%. It's a 1992 annual report on the Jamaican economy by the private sector organization of Jamaica, published in 1993. So me not really, let me do my research. I'm not, well, I should know by now, say me is not one way come and run off my mouth, and me not really have me ducks line up in a row. So it says, so by March 1992, the 12-month point-to-point inflation reached 105.7%. And this was under see him there? 90 under Michael Manley. So a PNP. And even if under Michael Manley, PJ went take over from him in 1992. Anyway, but PJ never take over yet. Because this was in, where then say? March. This was in March 1992. So obviously this would have been carrying over from 1991. Anyway, it reached, and it's a 12 months. So clearly it's still Michael Manley. 105.7%. So I'm not really too sure when PNP attacked about Michael Manley or Michael Manley was this. I don't get it. I'm not really too get it. I don't get it. Like, what did he do for Jamaica? Because when it comes to inflation and unemployment and economic growth, Michael Manley wasn't doing well. He's not. Let me see if he's in any of the good batch. Let me see if he's in any of the good batch. Good. Him not did it. He was the worst in terms of inflation. No, when it comes to the matrices in a good Michael Manley, you can see that I do the averages, you know. So, you know, the best prime minister, and you look at corruption, murder, unemployment, inflation, GDP, is basically, you know, PJ was the best when it comes to corruption. He was the least corrupt. When it comes to murder, was Portia Simpson. And then these three, unemployment, so this is the economy here, right? This is where the JLP flourish. But the thing is, we, the Jamaican people, are not seeing this benefit. That's the problem. It is not translating. It is not trickling down to us. So you have a job and you can barely make ends meet, and they are jumping, they're blowing their hands and saying, yes, unemployment is at 4.2%. Yes, unemployment is at 4.2%, but we don't have no policies in place for the people and pay we better. We can barely afford to survive. You dey work and you still need ketchup to pay your bills. How does that make any sense? And most of these are not even minimum wage jobs. People, it's not minimum wage job, people they work. And you can't afford to pay your bills. Because a front office agent, a auditor, a payroll analyst, a office, a admin, a team lead, these are not minimum wage job, and you still struggle to pay your bill. You still need somebody to assist you. If you is a man, you have to rely upon your parents or your brother or your friend. If you is a woman, if you don't have a man, dog name your supper. And JLP, but that's what the data shows. They, when it comes to the economy, they do well. The downside to that is, yes, the economy do well, but Jamaicans aren't.